Ngamana, Ngareo, Ngaiwi, Tonei. Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Natalia Garstecka aho. He kaimahi aho I te tuapapa kurakainga. Kia ora, everyone. When my boss asked me if I wanted to speak at the CHA conference and be part of this particular workshop, I said, oh yes. And then I thought, oh dear, this is going to be nerve-wracking. I've never spoken at a conference before, and it is a little bit stressful, but also exhilarating to be here. So I wanted to start with saying a thank you to Community Housing Aotearoa for inviting the ministry to be part of this important conversation. And when I was thinking about, offering a view from the funder's perspective and what I would say and what would be a good sort of starting point, I thought we have a lot of data. We have a lot of data through all the applications that come through from community housing providers to deliver new build public homes. So I thought setting the scene and placing those, I think we're talking about some more innovative financing structures, enigmatic creatures that are emerging on the fringes of the sort of more mainstream financing solutions for the sector. So I thought setting the scene, yes, and putting it in a little bit of a context would be good. Context. A short journey through history. Funding for community housing providers to deliver new build public homes was first available in around 2000. I think the Auckland RFP came out in mid-2015. It was relatively brief, but it offered operating supplement in addition to income-related rent subsidy or up to 50% of development cost contribution. It was later replaced by public housing plan, two subsequent public housing plans, and the main funding model for the sector has become to be the operating supplement. So as you all probably know very well, you need to go and find capital to build homes for people in need in the first place. And I think it would be unfair of me not to acknowledge the very difficult operating environment in which the sector currently faces, not just the community sector, but the private sector as well. We've seen construction costs skyrocketing in the last few years, and in the last sort of 12 to 18 months, interest rates, the cost of debt also going up along with the general inflation. So it is really hard. It is challenging to access finance, and especially through the sort of more traditional sources, the bank lending. And I think this, together with the funding settings that we have available for the sector, have fertilized the ground for the new structures to emerge. And then I thought, let's look at some numbers and where those structures are in a sort of grand scale of things. So very quickly, to date, over those last sort of 6 to 7 years, we've approved 3,100 public homes for delivery by community housing providers, and we're talking just about new builds. About 2/3 of those homes have been delivered and tenanted by now, which is fantastic. And just acknowledging that the sector has actually delivered more public homes than that, but we're talking just about new builds. 50% of those are owned by CHIPs, and I think this is really important for this conversation here. 46% through residential leases, and I think those were predominantly procured under the previous public housing plan. And just about 4%, so some of the transactions we've recently seen that are financed through those more innovative models. The total build cost is estimated at 1.4 billion, and where has that capital come from? About a quarter from the government and the sector itself, 190 million through CHIP equity, that comes mainly through as land that CHIPs own, but also assets that can be leveraged to get a bit more borrowing or cash. The big figure that really stands out is that 700 million bank debt. And just to caveat that number, about 40% actually belongs or is on the balance sheets of community housing providers, as estimated by us on the basis of information we receive from you guys when we get the applications for funding. Again, just on the sort of in the right bottom corner, 130 million, that's the sort of capital that is associated with those more innovative financing structures, the 4% of housing that I mentioned on the previous slide. And that comes from, institutional investors. It's mobilized for sort of impact investment, sources different than bank lending. And that kind of leads me to what that structure is. And I don't want to say too much because I feel I'm going to be stealing content from my fellow speakers. But in a nutshell, these structures are commercially put together through, I call them joint ownership. It's when the CHIP comes together with a private sector partner, they own the asset together, and the capital is mobilized from various sources. And I'm going to leave it at that. What is important, or what are the sort of observations from the funder's perspective on the transactions that we have seen to date? And like I mentioned, only 4% of the places we've approved for funding so far come through those structures. The good thing about them is that they take your equity further. So, in other words, for every $1 of CHIP equity, more housing outcomes can be delivered. And this is great news. But nothing is free, ever. And it is likely to come at a higher cost to HUD, which is understandable. A private sector requires a rate of return. The good thing, and what we've also seen on the transaction to date, is that the CHIP has the option. So it comes with a partial ownership from day one, which is really important for, I think, the sector, but also the government and under current policy, that CHIP ownership is prioritized. So the CHIP has the option as well to buy out its partner at the end of the contract term, which typically is about 25 years. But what has come apparent is that that outcome is sort of dependent on what happens in the market. So I think what's important for us to see going forward is that those models are stress tested for changes in the market, and it's something worth considering. They are more complex, the structures, so they do require a level of capability, whether it's already in-house or potentially needs to be outsourced, again, something to be considered. And it can take time, at least initially, for any given sort of product or solution to agree terms and negotiate. It can be a lengthy process. So again, something to be mindful of. What we're looking for, ultimately, is value for money. What HUD wants to see is good, fit-for-purpose, warm, safe homes for people that are in need, and especially in regional locations at this stage. So this is what, in a nutshell, I'll leave it at this because I think there may be some other questions following on that. That's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Kia ora. It's a privilege to be here. Well done to CHAR for hosting such an amazing conference so far. It's, as I expected, inspirational and sobering and challenging. The people in this room are at the forefront of making a difference to those that are outside of our mainstream housing system. But those same people are also outside the mainstream finance sector. They're on the periphery. And so for us to work together to couple what the government does with funding to bring in finance, what does that mean? It means more houses for those people we want to help. So I don't think most of us grow up during sort of primary school or high school and think, yeah, I want a career in finance. And I can assure you that was not what I planned. But I had the privilege and burden of getting to meet a lot of the wonderful people in this room and wanted to be part of helping you do more. So that's where community finance and positive capital come in. We're social enterprises who are committed to finding finance and capital to help you do more. Because I think we've all seen with our own eyes and heard these last couple of days, there is a real scale and mountain to climb for the increasing number of people who just don't live in the homes that they should. tech issues on the first slide. That's exciting. There we go. So, in a nutshell, what we believe is part of the solution is building a bridge between what have been separate worlds. On the one hand are the proven solutions, and that is you, the community housing sector. It is the charities and iwi groups that are leading the charge in providing not just the bricks and mortar, but the safe place to live and thrive. The bridge is about how do we then find the money to help you do more, and that is the challenge that our country faces, because houses are incredibly expensive. That's why we have this problem. So I like to start with just a reminder of why I get up in the morning and why you do too. It is sobering how much finance, capital and funding we need given how many people are displaced. We're lucky to have Shamabil Yaqub on our board. He's both a blessing and a curse. He's the definition in my world of ignorance is bliss. I was happy about knowing all of this, as I'm sure you were too. So he's taught me that nearly 65% of renters in our country are getting a government subsidy, or the housing provider looking after them is. Isn't that just enormous? And yet, for us to provide warm, dry, affordable, long-term public housing, market rent actually isn't enough to maintain them and look after them well too with finance. So what a mountain we face as a country. We know the waiting list and the scale of that. And if we were to apply, let's say, $700,000 as the cost for each of those new homes, that's the bill we face just to house those households. And we know there is far more than just the public household that need affordable housing. Big numbers for a country of just over 5 million. So that's why our team is excited by finance. Finance gives you today what you can't have, and we need those houses today. Something that makes me feel a little better, though, is New Zealand has $251 billion of funds under management. So when you first see that sort of $16, $17 billion figure, you probably feel it there. But look, we have the money already. And so this is about how do we strategically work well with government and the funding that they have been providing. How do we provide the bridge then for the funds we have as a country to not just go into the traditional corporate areas we invested in, but what if they started supporting you as a chip sector? We can all win that way. So finance is usually the big ticket item when you are building or buying a new home. So we normally are seeing 50 to 70%. We know with first home buyers, you've got that fixation on where do I find my 20% deposit? But if we put that in terms of that number before, that means finance, just for this one segment, might need to be around $10 billion. It's a big number. So we've talked a lot in the conference. Some have talked about the funding. We need the certainty, it needs to be there. We've talked about capital, finance, development. The answer is we actually need all of those working in unison to create more public houses. There are lawyers here, construction companies like home. It's quite good I can see that much of the people through the lights. Everyone in this room actually represents the sectors we need to do a lot more housing, just those us here. But to do so, yes, we need funding, but the funding won't be translated into houses if we don't then raise the finance for chips, if they don't have enough capital, because capital still requires a deposit or equity, loan to value ratios, and someone needs to build them well. Now, this gets me excited. I'm obviously a deeply odd human, so I won't spend too long on this, but this is our bridge. And at the top, you have foundations, trusts, fund managers. We get really excited at the thought of KiwiSaver, which is now around $90 billion, the everyday savings of us starting to be translated into bonds for, let's say, a Salvation Army, for them down the bottom to build more houses. So we've got the middle bit, and look, it does get dry, even for me. But the thing that's special is when we get to come and be invited to some of the openings of the houses you build and to see people in tears getting a home they never thought they'd have. And that's what actually this is about. And that's finance that's exciting. And it needs to be, because we would do all of this as a social enterprise with a low margin. And that's traditionally a very stupid way to set up a finance company. It's not the tradition for our country either. And it's not great commercially, but look at what it does if you lower the cost of finance. The funding from government can go further. You can help more people. And that's us collaborating. I can do one-on-ones for those that really want to have an in-depth. I'll save you. So we work with a range of community housing providers. That's just some of them up on the screen, and we'll be excited to confirm some others that we'll be working with this year ahead. And that's our real privilege. They do amazing things, and to date we've raised $120 million, mostly from fund managers and KiwiSaver providers, to help provide them the finance they need. That's exciting, but it always keeps you humble, doesn't it, when you see that 16 or 17 billion. We need to do more, all of us. So, finance has limitations though. If the funding is there, and if we can raise the finance, you still need your own deposit, capital, equity. And even the strongest chips have a limitation there. And I think we can't expect the government to provide all the grants there either. We've got a lot of work to do in a lot of areas as a country. So the next thing that we saw by working with the sector was that if we could, through impact investing, provide not just finance, but also capital, to exactly Natalia's point, what an opportunity then to do more. What if for $1 we could create $10 worth of new housing? And for the kid that didn't like maths, that's what as an adult gets me excited. So that is where positive capital came in. So a little bit, think of a progressive home ownership or shared equity program that a lot in this room have been trailblazers in our country doing that for households. We wanted to do the equivalent for a community housing provider. So in simple terms, you provide 10% as a deposit, and it's in our job, which is still hard, to find the other 90%. And so how that looks is you acquire a half share of the new homes up front, 50%, and we finance 40% of your half share. And then there is a fund we've created, which then for 25 years is sitting there, putting in the other 50% as equity. You repay that debt over that time. You're providing that warm, dry, stable, affordable home for people now, because we need it now. And at the end of year 25, the aspiration is you acquire the half share, and then it can continue for the next decades thereafter for affordable housing. It's making money go further. That's the secret to this when the scale of the problem is just so significant. And it's exciting that we had the first impact investor commit $100 million to this new program, which means 200 million of new public housing. So again, that's the beginning of scale, but it's still sobering when you look at the total need. Where spreadsheets are exciting, particularly for my wonderful team that look at spreadsheets all day, I think the thing that hopefully resonates for you is the multiplication, as in the people you know that you want to get into a home where this might be part of helping them get there. So on the first column, or the middle one, here's an idea of if you were doing 20 homes and they were costing, again, let's say $700,000 each, if you were putting 35% of your own money in, it's about $5 million. You would then borrow $9 million. We would have 20 families in a home. For about the same amount, this allows us to do circa 80. And again, it's all of these layering of how do we wisely work together that I think is really essential for being effective, having value for money, for HUD as well, and for getting these people into a home. Because you live and breathe it every day. Just for when I go and see people living in cars and in garages, we've done a lot, but boy, we've got a lot more to do. So thanks to everyone. It's an honour to get to serve this sector, and it's exciting to have finance being part of the solution. Thank you.
Kia ora, I'm back. So today I'm going to give you a snapshot, I think is the best way to put it, and some reflections on Court's experience of forming a joint venture, which was something we undertook to take advantage of or to best use the government funding settings that are available to us, which was the operating supplement. Before I go there, let me tell you a little bit about COURT. I think the context is important of who we are and how that all came to be. So COURT, small little acronym for Community of Refuge Trust, which was a small charitable trust that grew out of Ponsonby Baptist Church in the around 1987. I think around the same time, a lot of the NGOs who are represented here probably started. We currently own just over 300 homes across Tamaki Makaurau, and we lease another sort of about 100. We've got a smallish team. We're getting a little bit bigger. We've got 16, and we've got a team of tenancy and property management, a finance team, and a dedicated development team in-house. We have over the years become an experienced developer of new homes, and that was on the back predominantly for a period of time of some capital funding that was available in different ways, and particularly what was called the IRRS 1000 RFP, which provided capital funding to build new social or public housing. I make that point in that the formation of ACORT, I think, in some ways was a direct response to that funding no longer being available and us having to think about how could we best use the operating supplement, which was the new funding settings, knowing that we had limited equity. While COURT's been fortunate to build a relatively large asset base, equity is still something that is limited, and so we have to find ways to bring in external capital. I put this picture here just to remind us that our tenants are what's most important, and every time we get stuck halfway through a big legal document or some due diligence, we remind ourselves of why we're here. So what is ACORT? I think we've taken very much the unimaginative Pakeha kind of sense of what we call things, North Island, South Island, ACC, COURT, stick them together, you get ACORT. ACORT was formed in about 2020, and it's a joint venture between ACC, who you all know, I'm sure, but it's their investment arm, and COURT Community Housing. The original parameters of the arrangement was for ACC to provide $50 million of debt, which supported the development of 100 new homes in Auckland. Very much a crucial partner to all of this, of course, is HUD, providing the operating supplement into the JV, which allows the debt to be repaid over that 25-year period that you're all familiar with. So both the JV has an expiry date around year 25, as does those capacity and service agreements with HUD. ACC and COURT are joint shareholders in the structure. There's a general partnership and a limited partnership, and once the assets are created, they're basically shared equally by the two partners, or the equal shareholders, COURT and ACC. I was going to put up a structure diagram, but it's incredibly complicated, and I realised I might then have to explain it, so I decided to err on the side of simplicity and not include it here. Importantly, there's an ownership stake here for COURT, and I think that's really important for two reasons. It's important that we have what we refer to as skin in the game. We're absolutely committed to making this work, but more importantly, there's a long-term proposition for us to have first right to buy those homes at year 25 and be in a very good position to do so. The structure. So as I said, there's a general partnership and a limited partnership that were formed. There's 4 directors, 2 from ACC and 2 from COURT. The limited partnership, I suppose, is really the active vehicle in all of this, and that LP undertakes the development of the new homes, signing if you like, the simplest way to say that is the limited partnership signs the construction contracts and ultimately owns the assets once they're complete. Those are then leased to COURT as the chip over a 25-year period, and then we sublease those or rent those to tenants from the public housing register. In this structure, and I think one of the things that we bring to the table as the chip, and it's not just around the operating supplement, although obviously that's huge, but we're also providing the development services. So we're managing all of the development process, project management, etc. There's corporate services, which are part of the deal, as it were, in terms of the finance and some of the governing sort of things that are required. And then importantly, over time, we're doing the tenancy and property management. And so I guess you'll appreciate there's levels of legal framework that sits behind each of those that was created as the structure was born. Getting into the slightly more exciting part, what are the homes? Well, we've now got a pipeline of 104 that's flexed up a little bit as these projects have come sort of to fruition over 7 developments in Auckland. One of those is complete, and we were really fortunate to open 15 homes in Massey last year. We've got 6 under construction, and the final project is sort of in those final stages of consenting. 75% are 1 bedrooms, 25% 2. They're all medium density, which is where Court has some experience, and I think it's certainly what works in terms of our model of public housing. The smallest development is 8 units and the largest is 23. And really, most importantly, why do we do this? Well, it's so that we can continue to do our work for people in our community who are at the hard edge and most vulnerable. And I think for some of you who heard the work that we're doing with a pilot with Mahitahi and Te Tukutumai in terms of really focusing on how can we make the most impact in our community. And that's all of this feeds through into that, which is an incredibly important part to remember. This is some court housing that has already been completed and isn't part of this joint venture, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what are we actually talking about. We talk about homes sometimes in a very kind of theoretical sense, and it's nice to see what they actually look like. And there's a couple of renders of the current pipeline that we're working through at the moment. Be wonderful to come back and share some photos and some experience of the actual homes once they're finished in the next few years. What are our reflections of this process? There's a lot, to be honest, and there's a lot of learning, and we're still doing it. While the joint venture exists and funding has started, the building is working, we're still learning, we're still figuring this out to some degree. It has been an effective model for us where equity was limited. And obviously capital, our own capital was limited, and mainstream banking has obviously, as you know, some covenants that allow you only to borrow so much at any given time. It was really important for us to upskill in terms of our understanding of the long-term implications of a deal like this. I think Court had started down that journey, but we hadn't necessarily put a lot of thought into what happens at year 25. What are the implications for us, not just in year 25, but if we do this deal for 25 years, how many more of these deals could we do and what would that mean? There's considerable resourcing required, and I think it's really important for us to be honest about that. That was both internally, the amount of time that was taken, but investments from both Court and ACC into the legal costs and all of the other consultants. The structural and legal framework is complicated, and we're still working through that to some degree in terms of how the money flows, what are the bank accounts, how does that all work? We're getting there, and I think as it all settles down, it becomes quite an easy thing to operate. But again, I think honesty in that space is important in terms of how complicated these things can be. I think for these reasons, all of those relationships with those consultant partners is incredibly important. We've got a huge level of trust in the capability of our own legal kind of team, but we've also, it was crucial during that process to bring in people that our board and Court as an organisation trusted and could give us some really good advice, basically advise on that due diligence process. Our board was crucial in this whole process. They obviously went on a journey through this process as well, and I think their willingness to learn, their willingness to engage in concepts to some degree that we hadn't really tackled before was crucial into keeping this thing going. So I think if there's a message there, it's about taking your board on the journey as early as possible. The due diligence process is no doubt daunting to some degree, but I would also view it as ultimately a very supportive thing for your organisation to go through. You learn a hell of a lot about yourselves when you're asked some really tough questions that you know someone's going to be interested in the answers of. How do you do tenancy management? What are your long-term asset plans? How do you ensure all of those important metrics are met? How do you ensure quality in the long term? So I think we've viewed those as another important building block for Court. No matter what comes next for us, it's been an excellent process. Ideally as well, we're creating this structure where it can be added to in the future. So that investment in time and our own, I guess, all of the work that goes into it ideally doesn't have to be repeated too many times for more capital to flow. After all of that, the biggest reflection, of course, is that we're building 104 new homes, and without all of that work, we wouldn't have been able to do that. And so I think that's, again, we don't lose sight of the fact that that's at the end of all of this hard mahi. And I think that's probably the most important point to leave you on. That's really a snapshot, I think, from Court's perspective. As ever, we're very keen to pass on anything we've learnt, have those conversations. So, hey, do come and find me if you've got questions about that. or any other thoughts about how it might feel for you as a chip. I think flowing on from that, the next step for us is to introduce Judith, who's going to give a bit more of a legal kind of perspective and to talk about some of those structure, the pros and cons, and how it might work in different chip settings. Kia ora.
Well, kia ora tātou. As Stephen mentioned, my name is Judith and I'm a partner at Parryfield Lawyers. We are a law firm based here in Christchurch. It's an honour to be part of this conference and part of this sector. My interest in this space started as one of my first governance roles was as a trustee of a small charitable trust here in Christchurch that developed 11 social housing units and then was able to house whānau in those. Seeing firsthand the huge impact that having a home had on these people really gave me a passion for this area. So I and others in our firm really feel very passionate about the community housing sector. So today I'm going to talk to you about legal structures. Your eyes might have glazed over a little bit when Stephen was talking about limited partnerships, general partnerships, all those sorts of things. Today I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'm going to try and keep it quite high level, but be assured those things excite lawyers. So if you are getting on the journey of starting to provide community housing, do talk with your lawyers to get the right structure in place. So, which vehicle or which structure? What we're going to do today is Adelaide shortly is going to run you through sort of the life cycle of a project. But one of the first things that a lawyer might get asked is, which entity should I set up to provide some community housing? To start with, we'll ask you about your purpose. What are you trying to achieve and how will you achieve this? Just like you wouldn't pack 10 people into that little smart car to do a road trip across the backcountry of Australia, and you probably wouldn't use the biggest car ever built, longest car ever built to do your chores around Christchurch City. You want to make sure that your vehicle for providing the community housing is appropriate and will achieve your purpose. So some of the questions that we might ask you when you come in and say, we want to provide some community housing. We're going to ask you, what are you going to be doing? Are you going to be acquiring the land? Are you going to be doing the development and then tenanting out the premises? Or are you going to be simply leasing the properties from someone else who has developed them and doing the tenanting? It's really important to know what your role is in the project. What's the size and complexity of the project? Are you building and renting 3 units, or are you doing like what Court did and providing 104 homes? How will you pay for the project? So obviously we've talked a lot today about funding and finance, and it's really important to have an understanding right at the start how this project will be paid for, or some ideas of the different options. Funders and financiers will have different requirements in terms of what they want to see about the structure that you have in place and making sure that that is fit for purpose. Who will be involved? Will it just be your organisation involved, or will you be joining forces with other organisations, like we've heard Stephen talk about today? In terms of your particular organisation, who will be involved? It's important for both funders and financiers and yourself, your own organisation, to make sure that both the governance structure and the management structure is well suited to the type of project. If you're wanting to embark on a project that's going to be building 104 homes, and there's no one in your governance structure and no one in your management structure that has any experience in a large-scale project like this, haven't done any construction, haven't provided any community housing before, you probably need to ask some questions, and the funders and financiers will ask some questions as well. It's really important to have the right people in your structures with the right experience. So now I'm just going to give a high-level overview of just a couple of different structures that you might like to use. There are many different structures that can be used, but these will give you some ideas. So the first one is limited partnerships. So this is a corporate structure. It combines some key features from companies and some key features from partnerships. So you have one entity as the general partner, and they manage sort of the day-to-day running of the entity. And then you have your limited partners, who are your investors, and almost silent partners there. The positives of a limited partnership: well, liability for those limited partners, those investors, is ring-fenced. It's restricted to their contributed capital. So that's a bit of security for them. The general partner can manage the affairs of the limited partnership, so they've still got quite a bit of control about what goes on there. There's also privacy. The identity of the limited partners and the contents of your partnership agreement, they're not registered anywhere. So for some people and in organisations, that's important. The drawbacks: it is more involved to set it up. You do need a written partnership agreement. And obviously the investors or the limited partners, they can sort of negotiate their rights and obligations in this deal. So you do need to be careful that you agree on that before moving in. And there might be other FMCA requirements that you need to meet there as well, which again adds a layer of complexity. General partnerships: this is where two or more partners or organisations join forces. The liability is not ring-fenced, so those entities are jointly liable there. You could have a partnership agreement or a joint venture agreement, and we would always advise that yes, you should have one of those, but it is not a requirement. Again, these are private and aren't registered. And then the last one I want to talk to you about there are charitable trusts, which lots of you will be familiar with. So these are a separate legal entity. If your trust board is incorporated, it will be the entity that contracts. The liability of the trustees is limited if that trust is incorporated, and that's really important if you're getting volunteers onto your board. That will make them feel more comfortable about coming and becoming involved. When a charitable trust is registered, there's quite a lot of detail about the trust available for public searching, so that's something to be aware of. And also, because you're registered, the Attorney-General can also inquire into and examine the operation and condition of the charity, so someone can be coming in and looking at that. With a charity, your purposes are restrictive, so you must act to further the purposes that are in your trust deed. And those purposes must be charitable, so advancement of education, religion, relief of poverty, or any other purpose for the benefit of the community that's not in those three. It's important to set those up right at the start, because if you set up your charitable trust deed and you originally wanted to advance education, but now you're going to do community housing, that's not quite fitting. So we need to make sure that that structure is right. Tax exemption: if you are registered with Charity Services, your charity should be exempt from income tax on some or all of its income. There might be some other tax benefits there as well, and your entity might be eligible for donee organisation status, which allows donors to claim a tax credit when they donate to the charity. There are quite onerous disclosure and reporting requirements for charities, and especially the larger the charity is. But whilst that might seem onerous, being a registered charity does give your entity greater credibility. So that's just a bit of an overview of some structures. As we've heard today, there's obviously a lot of complexity the larger scale you go, and there could be lots of different structures that might need to be involved in what you end up doing. So you have an idea, you want to provide some more community housing. Where to next? Well, what we would suggest is chatting to your advisors early on. Adelaide's shortly going to give some more advice on all the steps of the project, and she also would encourage you to talk to your advisors early on. Also, I've got there meet up with others in the sector. As Stephen mentioned, he's happy to chat with you about his experience, but we're always pleasantly surprised in the sector how willing organisations who have they're further along on the journey, how willing they are to assist people. And in your welcome packs, you should have received a legal guide that we prepared for this conference. We're always very keen to provide any resources that might be useful to the sector. So please just let us know if there's an area that you would like us to provide a free article on or something like that. Yeah. I'm just going to leave you with a quote from Maya Angelou that says, "The ache for home lives in all of us, the safe place where we can go as we are and not be questioned." How wonderful if every whānau in Aotearoa could satisfy this ache and have a place to call their home.
Kia ora koutou. I was silly and learnt my lesson today that you don't send a PDF to a conference because it is tricky with the slides, so we have my slides now. But no, word for the wise, always send via PowerPoint. Kia ora koutou, ko Adelaide Brown toku ingoa, he mihi nui, he mihi mahana ki koutou katoa. So I'm Adelaide, I'm a manager in the KPMG Deals Advisory team in Wellington, where I focus primarily on government and infrastructure advisory services. I resonated with something James said, which was that when I was a child, I didn't dream of numbers. When I was a child, I wanted to help. I had the privilege of living in Malaysia for a couple of years and saw firsthand poverty side by side with wealth and privilege. And at that stage, I was in a position of privilege. And so that has carried me through in my career. And it's always been quite stark coming to New Zealand, my home, and seeing that's so prevalent, the issue here. So I started my career in the Community Housing Regulatory Authority and have since moved to KPMG. So I think there's a real role for the sector, and I just wanted to acknowledge everyone in this room and the people that have been on this stage before me and the mana that we have collected here today. So thank you. So off the back of Judith's presentation on legal structures and some of the due diligence you'll want to consider, I'm going to take you through a more commercial perspective. And for my part, I'm going to talk to you about three key things. So firstly, I want to summarise the difference between funding and finance. We've used those two terms today, but I think it's important to distinguish those. And then second, I'm going to provide an overview of how a deal may come together in the housing context. And then finally, I'm going to close with some considerations from a financier's perspective. And some of these may cross over with what Judith was talking about before, but useful to set those out. At the end of my session, you'll hopefully come away with an understanding of the role of finance, the sense of the process and how to potentially make it easier, and then the importance of right-sizing the deal to the opportunity. So let's jump in by defining some key terms that are sometimes used interchangeably. So funding refers to how the project is ultimately going to be paid for over the cost of its life. So in other words, it's the revenue sources where there's usually no expectation of those being repaid. Finance, on the other hand, refers to how the capital requirements are going to be met when the timing of project costs don't align to the funding that's available for the project. So financing costs will usually be met by the funding sources of the project. In fact, they will be met by the funding sources of the project. And they usually come with that expectation of repayment or a return on the investment. The final concept is the commercial delivery model, and I don't have it on the slide, but I'd quite like to just talk about it. And that's the set of relationships, obligations, risk allocation, and financial flows between the different entities involved in a deal that will underpin the relationship and how you will deliver your housing project. So looking back at funding, at face value, there's an inherent appeal to utilising your internal funding sources rather than seeking external finance. However, as you'll know, it simply isn't possible for many organisations in the community housing sector who don't have significant capital reserves based on the operating model where we're not here to make a profit, we're here to build people's lives and build houses that enable them to have a home. So the other thing on the funding side is that while there is government support under the current settings, that predominantly comes in the form of rent income, and that's through your IRRS or operating supplement contracts. And so both of these will help you meet the cost of debt over time. They don't often provide upfront funding for development costs. And there are some instances where they do. You know, we do hear of operating supplement being capitalised upfront in the regions, but it's not the rule. Finance, therefore, is your solution to manage that mismatch in timing. So when we think about sources of finance, I think it's also useful to just touch on this. The traditional source of finance is banks, and I think it was displayed at the start that when we think about how much money is funding housing projects, banks are the predominant funder. It was about 700 million from memory. So banks do provide traditional property financing, and they're the most well known. The challenge for the social housing sector is that those normal lending considerations that would occur in we'll call it like a vanilla market housing deal, don't often apply as well in the community housing context. And you may have experienced this in your time when talking to banks, because in usual circumstances, a bank is going to mitigate their risk by having the ability to exercise security. That is to say, if the money they've given you isn't being repaid, they could take that property back and take that as security. However, in the social public housing context, banks are rightly less willing because the result of that means vulnerable people lose their homes. So the effect of this is that rather than a bank being primarily interested in a project's LVR, so the loan to value ratio, it's essentially kind of how much money can the project achieve, what will its value be? They're going to be focused on the cash flows, so how much money and what are the cash flows of the project over time, over its life. And this means you essentially need to find a bank who's comfortable with the sector and willing to be flexible in terms of the lending structure, who might be more interested in lending based on cash flows as opposed to the project's LVR. Where am I? So that's where structured cash flow financing comes in. That's probably the example that I'll talk to most today. A point to note is that there is still a bit of a gap in the market in terms of being able to achieve a structured cash flow financing deal. Usually they occur for projects around 50 million or more, but I guess that's where someone like James and Community Finance becomes so interesting, because they're starting to meet that gap. But it's also where partnering can become useful, because one organisation can achieve so much, but by partnering and leveraging, you're able to achieve a better deal. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about how a deal might come together. And at the outset, I just want to say that there's many permeations of this, depending on where you're at, the assets that you have, the conversations that you've already had. You may be at different steps in the process, or it may occur differently to you, but this is one way of describing it. And we'll whiz through it so that we have time to go through the considerations of financiers at the end. At the outset and at the start, your first step is to define the opportunity. Once you know this, you become in a much better position to quantify the financial needs of the project, and then also to identify what the necessary skills, resources are to deliver on that project. So that's essentially setting out the context of the opportunity and everything that's required to achieve it. And once you know this, you can cross-check that and examine it against what capability is held internally and where you might need to bring in external advice. It's probably also at this stage that we'd advise engaging with HUD so that you can ensure broad support for the direction of travel. I know there's some difficulties in terms of the point at which you're able to get a contract. I've got a nod down here. So early communication is always what's going to support you best in these things. And from this point, we're now at the shopping trolley. So at this point, if you think they're required, you can bring on board your specialist support to help develop the proposal in more detail. In addition to property credentials, I think it's fair to say a lot of CHIPs don't maintain in-house property capability. If you're not developing at scale regularly, it's hard to retain those skills. So often we'll see property skills being brought in, but additional advisors can help you in developing your options for the commercial model. And just linking back, that commercial model is thinking about the roles, the obligations, the risk allocation, and the financial flows of the parties that are going to be involved. At this point, you're then in a position to approach the market with a clearer understanding of your needs and to be able to find a finance partner that's going to align with your objectives. I think the process can be somewhat chicken and egg. We are trying to source a long-term contract and attract finance simultaneously. And while it's linear, there's obviously interdependencies and different permeations. But the point I made earlier about engaging early will help. Talking with a bank early, whilst this is also about alternative finance, there's definitely a role for banks. And I think if you're able to build that relationship early, even potentially outside of the deal process, it will help you. I've seen research where a progressive home ownership product wasn't successful in trial stage because there are other factors, but they hadn't engaged with the bank, they weren't known, they didn't have established credibility, they didn't have that relationship. And so when they were trying to talk about something new, it ultimately fell down. So I can't encourage enough just building those relationships early. Okay, considerations for a financier. So playing back, we've talked about the need for finance and what stage of the process you'll go to a financier. To smooth the path, it's going to help to be aware of your financier's requirements early and understand when you need to engage with them, but then also think about how are they going to look at the opportunity that you're presenting them, because it's ultimately an opportunity combined with risk. So this slide sets out how they'll consider that risk and opportunity for the deal presenting. We'll start at the left and we'll work our way across. So size of the project. They're going to consider this relative to your current operations or to the size of your counterparties as well. For example, are you a full house provider looking to embark on a 200 property project? It's not often the resources wouldn't exist, but it can happen. And so this is really about, are you sizing the opportunity correctly to your organisation? In terms of experience, they'll want to look at who the counterparties to the deal are. Have you completed projects like this before? Do you have the scale and the systems to manage the risk? And again, if you're a smaller provider or if this is a new project, have you partnered with a pre-existing organisation, which is usually a really good way. I think is the example of the Waimahi Inlet is a really cool example of partnership in the chip sector. So with the focus on experience, it's really the financiers understanding who they would be entering into a deal with. From a risk perspective, and this is something that yourselves as CHIP would need to be thinking about, it's about, do the proposed deal structure and the risk sharing arrangements present a low risk to being repaid? Are the modelled returns or yield that meeting your needs and aligning to the requirement of their investment funds? Are your objectives in alignment? Is their risk allocation aligned? Is the proposed risk allocation aligned to their preferred risk allocation? LVR is something that a bank and as a normal financier is going to consider, and that's in the context of the surplus cash flows that you have available after debt servicing. And in this context, they're wanting to stress test your ability to make repayments under different scenarios. The last bit is just complexity. They'll want to manage any degree of complexity that's proposed under the deal structure to the size of the deal. Usually the more complex the deal structure, the bigger size of the deal the financiers will be looking for. So that's something to bear in mind as you go through the process with your advisors on what the legal structure is and how much complexity you build in. You want to right-size that to the opportunity and the return that you need and the return that you're willing for the financier to make. On this next slide, hopefully it's easy to read, I've set out some of the characteristics and investment profiles of the different types of investors. I'm not going to go through all of these today because I'm really keen that everyone has the opportunity to ask questions. This is a recorded session, so they'll be available for your reference later. But I think the thing to call out is the different time frames that the types of investors are likely to want to be involved in a different project. Your developers are much more likely to be short-termist, whereas an infrastructure investor the likes of ACC or AMP, they're more likely to look for a long-term stable cash flow, which is something that the community housing sector can present. So if I was to summarise, the role of finance in public housing is to meet the timing gap between rent revenue received through time and the upfront costs of development. Pulling a deal together can be non-linear, but is supported by building your relationships with financiers early. And financiers are focused on weighing up the risk and opportunity relative to the size of the deal. Therefore, it's important to right-size the deal properly. I hope this session has provided you with a clear understanding of the role of finance, the formation process and the importance of right-sizing. I'll pass it back now to Stephen before we take any questions. Thank you.
Kia ora, thank you. We've tried to cover a whole lot of ground today around finance, and we've really only scratched the surface, of course. So I hope it was a helpful introduction. I'm not the best timekeeper in the world, but I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions. But I think before we do that, just be nice to give one more round of applause to everyone who's come and shared their time and expertise. Thank you. So let's open it up to questions. I guess the reminder is that you've got some real experts on the stage, legal, KPMG. It's not usually cheap to ask these guys questions, so it's a really good opportunity to get it in at a very good deal. So any questions? I think Ben can pass it.
Darren Birch from Homes for People. We started 6-7 years ago with $0. We've received no grants, no significant amounts of money inherited to us as a trust. We've managed through the market upswing to build 29 houses and have just over a $5 million balance sheet now. And it's made me realise that $5 million seems like a lot when you've got nothing, but it doesn't seem like very much when you start talking about larger developments. What do you guys see? There's many organisations that have presented here that have inherited stock from councils or got $50 million balance sheets over periods of time. How can organisations in the $0 to $5 million and then the $5 to $20 million categories venture forward in such complex circumstances with housing?
It's a great question. I'll just say 30 seconds worth, which is that Court was in that position some years ago, and the only answer for us was time and being quite opportunistic about what was in front of us at that time. That may not help you initially, but I think James might be a good person to have some reflection on how do we bridge that gap.
Kia ora. Good question. I don't think there's one answer. It's a bit, and not wanting that to be a cop-out, but there isn't one solution. I'd start with all of us, with the organisations we serve in, have to hopefully have a plan and a strategy. Not every group has to keep growing. If you're wanting to grow, I think it's really important, as I think the sort of panels talked about, in sticking to your lane. One of the greatest strengths of this sector is its tenancy management, the way it looks after people. What a court has is expertise in development. Some of the chips we work with can do that. Some of them need to partner with another construction company or developer to do that. So I think, unfortunately, it is a little bit dependent on the skill set in the management team, the board. Certainly we see some growth where it's acquiring homes from others and then doing what you do brilliantly. To do development finance now with 5 million at scale, it's hard and it could be dangerous. So we're seeing it, but it's with caution and you need the right partners.
Any other questions? Comments?
It's Alpha. Just got a question. What are your minimum requirements in regards to LVR and debt servicing? And what are the kind of test rates are you using?
Is that James? Is maybe
please.
is our
Yep,
probably
James.
Yep.
Yeah, good question. I think one point to clarify to start with is that our focus has been in supporting public housing, and that's been where there's really, we feel, the sweet spot where the funding enables it to be affordable for the tenant, and for there to be that cash flow and certainty around the funding coming in, so that there can be more confidence in the finance that's provided. So we started off going to foundations and trusts who were the first group to invest in us to enable us to do that. And then it's been a journey of moving to fund managers and KiwiSaver providers. So at the moment, I think that sort of typical 60 to 70% loan to value ratio is still what is normally there in the market. I think as the maturity changes in this country, as providers demonstrate what that funding can do, the conservatism that isn't always based on reality will shift, and there'll be better opportunities there. But at the moment, the traditional sort of deposit is necessary, and that's why, whether it's with A-Court or what we've done with Positive Capital, to solve that, we bring in the capital rather than increasing the risk.
I think we've got time for one more, depending on the complexity of the answer, I suppose. Any other questions?
Kia ora, I'm Nikki Harrison. I'm a trustee of the Monte Cecilia Housing Trust. I was just really interested to know, in terms of the buyout option that you negotiated in your JV at the 25-year, at the end of that 25-year term, from a trustee's perspective and from like a responsible financial management perspective, how do you budget to save for the big balloon that's coming up in 25 years?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's, I think, part of the learning and hopefully the maturity within the organisation around taking those longer horizons and what do we do about it. There's a simple way, I guess, to consider it as a ring-fenced proposition, and that at that point, because we also half own those assets at that point, and we'll assume let's assume there's some capital uplift over 25 years, that the LVR essentially at that point will allow us to, we could repackage that up in terms of financing with the mainstream bank. But it is an excellent question in terms of tomorrow, if the same proposition was there and that hit at year 26, would we do another one in year 27? And so we're almost stress testing ourselves on that longer horizon about how these deals might sit against other deals of similar size. So just the short answer as well is that we certainly brought in some additional financial modelling capability to help us with that as well, and to give some assurity to our board, obviously, but to the other partners that we'd thought through all those questions in some detail.
Thank you. And just a follow-on question. So the amount that you end up buying back at, it's the then current market value?
That's right, there'll be a reassessment as part of, in there. In that stack of legal stuff, there'll be some very clear instruction on how that's valued at the time and how that process falls. Yeah. Well, I think it's time for afternoon tea, which is very much looking forward to. So thank you again for attending, and thanks to all our panellists.